Chapter 12. Bad Reception. The walls of the great hall of the king's palace were covered with intricate tapestries and paintings, hunting trophies, and relics of a bygone age. There was plenty of room to see every noble in the country, along with their entire retinue, and indeed, it had done so on many occasions in the past. The head table at this banquet was to be found at the very back of the great hall. The floor here was slanted almost imperceptibly upward, so that the royal family of Florif could look down upon their subjects as they ate. Even on a day such as this, where the emphasis was on the newly married couple, the king took pride of place at the very centre of the table. The queen sat just to his right, with Princess Alice beside her. Next to the king on the left side of the table was Prince Goti, with Jenni next to her husband. Princess Maribella, as custom decreed, wasn't sitting at the head table at all, but was with her husband, Prince Tulf, at one of the satellite tables. There were 26 satellite tables in all, one for each ducal family of the realm. Each of these small tables displayed a small flag at its centre. This flag displayed the livery of one or other of the dukes, and was used as a guide to denote who was to sit where. In some cases the tables were crowded. Duke Rios, for example, had brought more than 20 people with him, and they were all seated at the same table. There was the Duke and his wife. Together they had 7 children, and the 2 eldest children were both male, and had wives and children of their own. On top of that, a place had to be reserved for Duke Rios' personal advisor and his knight champion Zavotrion. Princess Jenni, still tingling with the whole fairy tale feel of the day, began to look around the room. It was strange how many people she recognised, and even how many she didn't. She had met Zavotrion just once before, when Duke Rios had visited the Moth Castle. That must have been nearly 10 years ago now. Jenni was sure she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Yet she knew him and recognised him as soon as she saw him, with his huge shoulders, and that broad chest of his that seemed to bristle with muscles, even under the relatively loose clothing of his formal wear. Perhaps it helped that he had recently made a name for himself at the great tournament in Borton City just a few weeks ago. It was strange to see Zavotrion without his sword, a custom-designed long blade with an eagle perched on the end of the hilt. But then, no one was wearing a sword at the wedding feast. Everyone was friends here. Who was there to fight? Looking elsewhere, Jenni's eyes fell upon the figure of Cardos the Great. He was sitting as expected with his master, Duke Quince. It was rumoured that Cardos the Great, or Cardos Quigley, as was his given name, was one of the most powerful magi in the kingdom, second only to Phalid, Klemper, and maybe Manglos. This was a matter of pride. While Jenni's father had always claimed that Manglos was the most powerful mage in the kingdom, outside of the palace, Duke Quince had pretty much said the same thing about Cardos the Great. The two had never met to decide which of them was truly the most powerful. As Manglos would often say about such a suggestion, "I'm not interested in such childishness." 3 of the tables seemed almost depressingly low on occupancy. This was most noticeable because 2 of the tables in question were quite close to the head table, having been given pride of place at the feast. A 3rd table was totally empty. This table was near the back of the room and was tucked in behind the one where Duke Rios and his kin were sitting, so at first Jenni wasn't sure if anyone was really there or not. It was a table reserved for Duke Arlis. Since the current ruler of that small island dukedom was little more than a baby, it was understandable that he wasn't attending, although Jenni would have thought the Duke's regent might have come. The moth table was located very close to the front and had been placed on Jenni's side of the room so that she could almost talk to the occupants without having to shout. Only 2 people sat at the table, Jenni's mother and father. Greyfulf and Tyr, whose absence Jenni had noted at the actual wedding ceremony, continued to be absent at the feast. True, it was a long way from Moth to the capital, but her brothers would have known that, and they would have made allowances and left early. So why weren't they here? It wasn't just that there was no sign of her brothers, but there was no sign of Manglos, Sir Grant, Sir Richmond, or Anida either. She had hoped to see all of them. It had been more than a year since Jenni had last seen Anida. She had been hoping to find some time to chat with her best friend here at the wedding feast. Jenni had even made a point of ensuring that Anida would get an invite, since it wasn't normal custom to invite the children or even the wives of a Duke's champion. Jenni couldn't help feeling a little depressed. Anida was supposed to be her best friend. And she couldn't even bother to come to Jenny's wedding? Then again, why would she when Jenny's own brothers hadn't bothered to make the trip? Jenny sighed. A tear came to her eyes as she tried to think of something else. Her own family wouldn't have deserted her like this unless it was something serious. Yet what could be so serious that they would miss their sister's wedding? Prince Goatee couldn't help noticing the tear, nor did he miss Jenny's attempt to hide it. "Are you all right, Daffodil?" Jenny scowled at him and then nodded. "I'll be fine. I'm just missing my brothers, that's all." The prince nodded. "I wonder what's keeping them. I'm sure they'll be here soon. They probably just got stuck in traffic on their way here." Jenny smiled at him. "I hope that's all it is. Horse and tiger, I hope that's all it is." The third table that had a strangely low occupancy was that of Jenny's grandfather, Duke Ganespa. Now it was true that Duke Ganespa's wife had died a little over 12 years earlier, and that his daughter, Breedin, was actually there at the feast. She was Jenny's mother after all, and she was sat next to Jenny's father. No, what bothered Jenny was that there was still no sign of the Duke's son, his son's wife, or his son's children. Also, she couldn't help wondering where Sir Redbourne, the Duke's advisor, was, or, for that matter, Sir Batten, his champion knight. Duke Ganespa seemed to notice that Jenny was looking his way. Since the feast hadn't officially started yet, it wouldn't until the king made his opening speech, he got out of his chair and walked over to her at the head table. Jenny wasn't ready for what he did next. The Duke stopped about 5 feet from Jenny on just the other side of the table and bowed deeply. In the past, whenever the Duke had visited Castle de Moth, or when she had been a party to visiting Castle Ganespa, it had always been she who had had to curtsy to her grandfather. After all, he was a duke, and she had been but a lady. Now she was a princess, and it seemed the tables were turned. "Grandfather," Jenny said happily by way of greeting. She felt as if she should stand up and greet him properly. She wasn't sure what the proper protocol was. "It's good to see you." "Good to see you too, granddaughter," Duke Ganespa replied. "I wish it was under better circumstances." Jenny felt confused. "How do you mean?" "I must admit," the Duke continued, "I was surprised when you didn't postpone the wedding." Jenny was feeling very confused. She turned her head looking to the prince for moral support, but he just looked back at her and shrugged. "I have no idea what he's talking about." "You don't know?" Duke Ganespa said. "But your brother sent you a message. Must have been almost a week ago now. It should have arrived no less than 4 days ago." "I received no message," Jenny said. She looked hopefully at her new spouse, but he just shook his head. Duke Ganespa looked stricken. He glanced quickly towards the king. The king was busy chatting with his queen. He turned his attention back to Jenny. "Then we may already be lost." "Lost?" Jenny said. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" "Your brother, Tia, received a visit from a certain other brother of yours. The, winged one?" Duke Ganespa said, almost as a whisper. Jenny nodded. She glanced worriedly towards the king, but he was still busy chatting to his wife, and hadn't overheard a word. However, as she was looking that way, she noticed that the king's mage advisor, Falid, standing just behind the king's chair, as he usually did at these occasions, leaned forward and whispered something into the king's ear. She turned her head back to Duke Ganespa and mouthed her brother's name. "Race?" The Duke nodded. He warned Tia that today was the day the elves were planning to... The king stood up from his chair and cleared his throat. Falid announced an introduction, his voice somehow enhanced so that he could reach every corner of the great hall without having to shout. "Take your seats, please, dukes and duchesses, ladies and gentlemen, knights of the realm. The king is about to make a speech that will officially start the feast." "I have to go," Duke Ganespa commented. "No, wait," Jenny said. "What are they planning today?" She was too late. The Duke was already heading back to his table. The king waited until everyone was seated and all eyes were on him before he spoke. When he spoke, his voice seemed to have been enhanced by the same spell that Falid had used. "Noble folk of the kingdom, I am pleased to see so many of you here today to witness the joining of my son and his beloved in holy matrimony. Was it really as long as 1500 years ago that my ancestor, King Morton and Borton, arrived from across the great ocean to this new continent?" It was at this point Jenny stopped listening. She knew the story well. Her father had taught it to her in great detail during their evening schooling lessons so long ago. What was more, the king included the story at every royal occasion so that the nobles of Florif would never forget their origins. Somewhere, around 1500 years ago, there had been a war. No one could really recall exactly where their homeland was anymore, or who they had been fighting, only that it had been humans fighting against humans. Perhaps that part was intended as a cautionary tale, against assuming that only elves, goblins and harpies could be the enemy. Captain Morton Borton had been the admiral of the war fleet. He had 27 ships under his command. A piece of the whole of one of the ships was in a display case in the palace entryway. The Armodon, the Cat's Paw, the Queen of Wonders, the Seahorse, ships as famous in their own way as those that captained them. Morton Borton, his brother Frakin Borton, Sir Con Lemise, and Fedria the Moth, to name but four. It was said that few people could remember the names of all the ships, but every noble family knew the name of the ship that their ancestor had captained. Captain Morton had been given the task of taking an army consisting of close to 5,000 heavily armoured men across a stretch of water to flank an approaching enemy army. The thing was, by this stage of the war they had already lost. The admiral knew it, his captains knew it, and even the generals leading the ground forces knew it. It was only the king of the country who refused to accept defeat and insisted on fighting for a lost cause, regardless of the cost. The day before the great fleet was set to sail, the captains all met at a secret meeting place and decided not to attack the enemy, but instead to find themselves a new home somewhere away from their hated enemy, and a king who would continue to throw good men's lives away trying to win a war that was already lost. It seemed strange to Jenni that all the captains agreed. She wondered sometimes if maybe there weren't really more than 27 ships, and the others had refused to take part in the mutiny. It wouldn't be hard to imagine that the Florif version of history would have erased their memory. If any others did exist, they had long been forgotten. It was the women that always confused Jenni the most. There was never any mention of how women had got on board the ships. Clearly there must have been women on the ships for the new country to flourish, and Jenni could easily imagine the captains of the ships smuggling their families on board. There were no human women waiting for them on the land that was to become Florif, so the humans must have gotten their women from somewhere. Since it wasn't in the histories, Jenni couldn't help but think the crews of the ships had done something very nasty, such as attack an undefended coastal settlement and kidnap all the women. On the other hand, it might be something simpler and more benign, such as telling the soldiers what was being planned and giving them permission to bring a loved one on board. It seemed unlikely to Jenni that the captains would have done that, as many of the soldiers were likely to still be totally loyal to the king. But then again, no one was really sure how bad things had gotten, or what the attacking army did to the women in the towns they captured. Maybe the soldiers would have jumped at the chance to get their wives and sweethearts safely away from the conflict. Anyway, the ships sailed across the ocean and suffered many hardships, and maybe as many as 20% of them died. Eventually, though, they found land. The country that was to become Florif was Elvish back in those days. Actually, it was part of the country of Elistrade. The Elven Empire, as it was now, hadn't existed back then. The 7 Elven lands were constantly at war with each other, and with the goblins. Humanity's first encounter with elves went badly. The elves attacked, armed only with stone clubs and wooden spears. The elves were no match for the well-trained and well-armed army that humanity had deployed against them. A town was founded, First Town. It was built on the ruins of an old elven settlement. The elves fled to the north and formed a battle line against this new threat. The country was named Florif, after the wife of Captain Borton, Flora. The newly designated army of Florif pushed north. At first they attacked the elves because they feared a possible counter-attack. In the end they just kept pushing north, flushing the elves before them, looking for a natural defensive barrier that would demark the new country. When they reached the top of the peninsula, they stopped, fearing they would have to thin their forces too much to advance any further. Despite all advantages the humans had, better weapons, better tactics, better armour, it still surprised Jenni that a mere 5,000 soldiers could take so much land so quickly. Arlis was pretty much the last place for the humans to take. There had been harpies on the mountains there, and they had begun to prey on the livestock at First Town. Something had to be done about them, and so the newly appointed King Morton sent a punitive force armed with bows to shoot them out of the air. It was said that during this battle the harpies learnt the true value of a bow, and that up until that day they had always fought with their claws. That was then. These days there was little difference between the types of weapons used by human, elf or goblin. A human knight was still said to be capable of taking on and beating 10 elves or goblins in a pitched battle, but that was because the humans trained almost constantly, while those of the other races simply didn't. So, said the king, bringing his speech to an end, there was a single apple sitting on the table in front of the king. This was the only item of food on any of the tables in the Great Hall, except for the huge serving tables that were located in that room's centre. As the king brought his speech to an end, he picked up this lone apple. I hope you'll join me in wishing my son and his new wife happiness in the coming years. Then he took a single bite of the apple, signalling the start of the feast. Now that the king had taken his first bite, the servants that had been gathered around the serving tables quickly began to distribute the food. It was amazing to watch. There were 2 servants dedicated to each table, and they moved swiftly to supply their given table with all manner of succulent goodies. They started by giving out large plates of meat, and then moved on to garnishes such as fruit and vegetables. Wine was also one of the first things to be taken to each table. Then Jenni recognised one of the servants, Sue. The servant, Sue, looked at Jenni when her name was called. She dropped a quick curtsy but didn't say anything. To speak to the princess would have been a break in protocol. Jenni watched Sue, somewhat confused. Sue was a chambermaid. What was she doing down here serving the meal? The only thing Jenni could think of was that there were so many guests, the kitchen staff simply couldn't cope, and so servants from other parts of the palace had volunteered to help out. Slowly the tables were filled with food. At the head table, the largest plates with the suckling pig and the roasted duck were laid in front of the king and queen. In front of Jenni and her new husband were plates of chicken legs, clams, sausages, grapes, cheese, bread, apples, oranges, and a few other garnishes. Jenni hesitantly helped herself to one of the chicken legs, examining it carefully. Then she tucked in, stripping the meat off of one side. Are you all right, Daffodil? The prince asked her, helping himself to a clam. Just worried, Jenni replied. Duke Ganespa clearly had something on his mind when he spoke to us. There was a loud noise from somewhere outside the palace. It was followed shortly after by several similar noises, and they continued in quick succession. Occasionally something that sounded like a loud thud could be heard over the racket, along with what Jenni thought was the sound of masonry falling. What's that? Jenni asked worriedly. I'm not sure, the prince replied. He looked hopefully for clarification from his father, but it was clear from his expression that the king was as surprised by the noise as Jenni. The sound of a door opening somewhere at the back of the hall, almost lost in the noise coming from outside the palace, suddenly caught Jenni's attention. Admittedly, there were doors opening and closing all the time, as servants were constantly bringing more food and wine into the hall. But this particular door didn't lead to the kitchen. This was a door that led to the royal quarters of the palace. There was a loud clang, as of an iron-shod staff hitting the marble floor of the great hall, and then a haggard figure stepped through the door. It was the Major Advisor Klemper. He looked a little scruffy, as if he hadn't had the opportunity to shave in well over a year. He seemed to be staggering quite a bit, and was using his staff to keep him propped up. But he looked a lot better today than he had at any other time this year. Each step Klemper took was accompanied by the loud clang of his staff hitting the floor. The mage staggered slowly over to where the king was sitting, and took what had been his normal post at the king's left shoulder, up until the day he had fallen sick. Are you sure you're all right? The king asked concernedly as he looked over his shoulder. I'll be fine, thank you, my liege, Klemper replied. His voice was hard and croaky, as if he had to force the words out. Jenni, for one, felt relieved to see him. It was true that Philide had had a hand in making the beautiful wedding ring that now adorned her finger, but it had also been he that had seen through the magical trinket that her brother Race had been wearing. Jenni would blame all the world's ills on Philide if she could. She had been certain that he had cast some spell on Klemper to make himself the only source of advice in the kingdom. It was good to see Klemper not just present, but obviously well on the way to recovery. That he should choose her wedding day to make that recovery only made the celebration all the more potent. Suddenly, Klemper seemed to lose all coordination in his feet, and he collapsed. Philide was by his partner's side in a second and aided his fallen comrade back to his feet. Do you need to sit down? I can fetch you a chair, Philide asked with genuine feeling. I'll be fine, my friend, Klemper replied earnestly. If you're sure. Philide really did sound concerned. Jenny wondered if she had misjudged him. Faleed retook his position at the king's right shoulder. "Thank you for your concern," Clemper commented. He patted Faleed gently on the back. "I'll be fine, my friend. I'll be fine." Clemper then moved back to his post. Prince Goatee started in earnest to try and open the clam. He had obviously opened dozens of clams and oysters during his life, and had it down to a fine art. Then, before he swallowed it, for some reason the prince decided to sniff it first. Then he put it back on the table. "You know, I think this clam might be off." "Have something else." Jenny waved her arms at the wide selection spread before them. Prince Goatee took one of the apples and bit into it. The loud noises continued outside the palace. The king turned his attention to Faleed. "Go and see what that racket's about, would you?" It was Clemper who answered. "The harbour's catapults and ballistae are firing in celebration of your son's wedding, my liege." "I see," the king commented, a little irritated. "Are they going to be making that blasted racket all day long?" "I doubt it, my liege," Clemper promised. Jenny returned her attention to her chicken leg, but she was stopped by a loud shout from the table of Duke Quince. Cardos the Great had stood up and was trying to alert everyone's attention. "Don't eat the food!" "It's all off?" The prince looked at his apple doubtfully. Jenny looked across at the prince's apple. It looked all right to her. She then looked at the chicken leg. There was nothing wrong with that either. She took another bite. "Don't eat the food," Cardos insisted. "There's an enchantment on it." "Enchantment?" Jenny mumbled. She spat out her mouthful of chicken and saw the prince spitting out the apple. Jenny had already swallowed half the leg. Would that be enough? Would her ring protect her from the enchantment? She wasn't sure. Her heart started to pound heavily in her chest. "Rubbish," Clemper said. He already seemed to be vastly improved compared to how he had looked when he first entered the Great Hall. "The food is fine. I checked it myself before I entered the room." "I tell you," Cardos said as he held up a leg of lamb, "this meat has been enchanted." "What sort of enchantment?" the king asked sternly. "I'm not sure," Cardos replied. "I need more time to examine it." Clemper left his place from behind the king. He walked a little faster than he had when he had entered the Great Hall, but each step was still punctuated by the loud clang of his iron-shod staff. He had to circumnavigate the head table, and then walk across the floor to the table at which Duke Quince and his family sat. "Enchanted. Let me see." Cardos handed the leg of lamb to the major advisor. Jenny glanced round to look at Faleed. Why wasn't he doing this? Surely of the two, Faleed would have been the obvious choice, though Jenny would have to admit that she felt more comfortable knowing that it was Clemper and not Faleed that was double-checking the food. "You see what I mean?" Cardos commented. "Yes," Clemper replied. "I don't see how this could have—" Cardos the Great suddenly let out a loud sigh. It almost sounded as if he had just realised something. Then he began to fall. He fell forward onto the table at which he had been seated. There was a large hole in the back of his clothing, and a damp red substance was quickly staining the area immediately surrounding that hole. He had clearly been stabbed. Standing directly behind where Cardos had sat was one of the serving girls. She held a dagger sparkling with the mage's blood in her hands, and on her face was a huge, almost gleeful smile.